Hey, writers and readers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. Joining me today is Dan Stout, author of Titanshade. It's a hard-boiled cop drama set in a 1970s-esque fantasy world where the titular corruption-infected city is kept warm by the heat of a tortured infernal god, some of the detectives have face mandibles, and the best squad cars come with 8-track players. It follows trouble magnet Detective Carter and his Mullencompy partner Ajax as they investigate the gruesome murder of a visiting diplomat, a quest quickly complicated by more deaths, political interference, expensive sorcery, and Carter's own painful history. Titanshade is available now from DAW Books. And Dan, thanks for joining me on Fictitious.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I hope that description does some kind of justice to Titanshade. I feel like this is one of those books where trying to sum up what it is easy enough in the something meets something kind of format. And at the same time, it's so much more than that. When I first saw the cover, my first thought was Alien Nation meets Payback. But, reading it now, I think I would call it more like Chinatown for the fantasy reader with maybe a dash of Hammett. If that's not too punny to say it that way. Can you elaborate more on the story and then just kind of also give us an idea of where you would place this in genre?
Well, I think your summation of the story is a pretty great starting point, actually. I think you hit most of the key points. That 1970s buddy cop, 70s technology in a fantasy world is something that I've been wanting to play with for a while. And just the idea that in a fantasy world over time, that cultures will develop their own technology and they'll advance beyond that sort of pseudo-medieval Europe period that we see so many stories set in. And getting a chance to see cultures and different species interact in that realm was really exciting to me. So once I dove in and started to think more about it, I realized that as they develop technology, they'd have their own industrial revolution. They'd develop increased urbanization. And with that would come a need for an infrastructure, things like a police force and a fire department. And if you're going to have a police force, you're going to have homicide cops. And if you're going to have homicide cops, you're going to have some gnarly mysteries sooner or later. So I see it as sitting definitely on the speculative end of the genre mishmash. But there's certainly that strong noir element as well. And I worked very hard to hit the tropes and the expectations of both the noir and the fantasy, so I could deliver both rather than compromise one to meet the other's expectations. It's a lot easier now to do something like that because we have technology to have multi-genre stories represented because you can buy stuff online rather than just on dedicated shelf space in bookstores.
In general, I think I've said this a lot on the show as it's gone along. I love mashups. I love that exploration of different kind of genres and how they meet together. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they elevate the genre in a great way. I like something that you mentioned there was that a lot of fantasy stories seem to be encapsulated this frozen sort of aspect of culture where there'll be thousands and thousands of years of history that are all kind of operating at the same level. Technology hasn't really evolved. If you have magic, it seems to stall out where cultures develop. And I feel it's something that sort of arrested development of fantasy worlds is almost a given in a lot of the genre. So I like that you point out that this is your chance to take a look at something and say, okay, here is a fantasy world. It does have sorcery. It does have this idea of mana, this technology that's powered by magic, but now it's early in the story, you kind of established that has kind of gone away over time, that magic is now an expensive thing. It's not around as much and people can't get as much access to it. So they do have to depend more on technology. So you meet those fantasy ideas here in that 70s setting. I thought you delivered that really, really well. It's very well realized and it doesn't feel ungainly. I think sometimes you can feel if you're bouncing those two things together, one can really heavily outweigh the other. And I didn't get that here. What was your approach? You mentioned you're working with a genre that does have a lot of tropes and does have a lot of notable elements to it when you talk about noir and hard-boiled cop stories, and then you're introducing all these other big ideas to it. So what was your methodology for balancing those two things out?
The way I did is I tried to approach the story. The noir elements are progressively darker tale. So any noir story is sort of a downward spiral of paranoia and corruption. Fantasy books tend to be wonder books. They emphasize this sense of exploration and wonder, even when they are kind of the grimdark variety, even a Game of Thrones type thing. There's still a sense of wonder. There's still dragons, man. So finding ways to hit notes of wonder within a progressively darker spiral in the format of a murder mystery really rolled itself together. And once I kind of hit that formula, it all sort of took care of itself as I went along.
There's a moment midway through the book where you have this divination officer. So it's somebody who actually works with the police, but she uses magic in order to do channeling of the dead and to help with their investigations. And through an apprentice, tries to channel a dead person, the big murder mystery at the center of the story. And I thought it was really fascinating way. That scene encapsulated for me in a lot of ways how you would blend that, like you said, that idea of wonder, that person who is like channeling the dead and trying to gain information from them, but with this distinctly noir take where it's like it's a pretty gruesome scene in its own way, and that there is a great human sacrifice required, not full-blown human sacrifice, but a sacrifice on a human level in order to do that. And I thought that really kind of brought it home for me, where I was like, where this story takes place, because there is big magic, but it's like difficult. Grim and gritty is such an overused term, but like it applies in a 70s style drama and in a noir. So I thought you handled that really well. It's also clear to me that you did your homework on noir and hard-boiled storytelling in general. There's like a movie level of attention to like physical detail here. I don't know, like there's sort of like movie visuals of cops in their element, holding their nose when they're like stressed out, or like the physical mannerisms that you see in an environment where people's emotions can twist and turn on a dime based on the pressure they're in. What was like the prep that you were doing in order to inform this story in this world?
Well, part of what you're talking about is just my natural mode of writing. So I've tried writing in all kinds of different genres, more or less successfully. And what I found is as I work in more and more different areas, that noir voice just came out very naturally to me. One of the first things I ever wrote was a noir set in a middle ground playground. And I love the story. It's fantastic. It's all about a crossing guard who's trying to bring some justice to the middle grade school. But just finding those tropes and that kind of clipped dialogue style and those tiny visual signifiers that really help set the reader's mind in noir. Because when we talk about noir, there's a huge tradition of noir literature. There's a huge tradition of noir radio plays. But the thing that everyone thinks of is the Maltese Falcon. It's the noir movies. That's what we think of. So by grabbing some of those similar, familiar images and dropping them in strategically, I can reinforce the concept in the reader's mind that this is a noir story, even though there's sorcery, even though there's people running around with face mandibles and amphibians with their lives in danger.
When you were selling this, picking up an agent, taking this to a publisher, what were those initial reactions? Did they get the concept right off the bat? Was it something that you had to like really say, okay, no, look, I mean, I know that this is a mashup, and sometimes like audiences are here for it, or sometimes they're not, depending on like, how much they like to stretch their reading. So like what brought it home when you were like selling the book? What did they really pick up on?
Well, I'll tell you what, my agent contacted me. My first published story was a straight crime noir gritty piece. And he read it and he reached out to me and said, hey, if you ever write a novel, send it in to me. And, a year later or whatever, I came in a book full of face mandibles and magic and weird cinnamon smell. And I don't know that he knew exactly what to think when he got it. But to his credit, he kind of rolled with it and said, all right, well, let's dive in and tighten it up and we'll take it to market. And we had that conversation where when you blend genres this intensely, it can be a hard sale because it's tough for marketing departments. Where does a bookstore shelve it? How do you tell it to people? But we put together a package and we went out on the market with it. And Sheila Gilbert at DAW read it and she just fell in love with it. And I think she got it on a really deep level. She understood what I was doing as both a mystery and as a fantasy story. And the folks at DAW have done an amazing job of packaging this together and helping explain what it is in a really visually appealing way to potential readers.
I was in my local Books A Million yesterday and walking around, and I saw the hardcover on the shelf, and I was immediately struck by like how much that cover sells the book. Especially in fantasy, there's a lot of stuff right now where like I get frustrated sometimes because there's a lot of generic covers and there's a lot of things that really, I mean, you go into certain genres, like if you go into like thriller, you'll see the same font treatment, the same like Gone Girl kind of look, because they want to say, oh, you liked this, you'll like this, you know. And a lot of fantasy, there's some sort of repetitive, there's some beautiful covers, but there's some repetitive things that don't catch me as much. And I felt like this one really jumps off the shelf. Like it really, like you said, it gets across the point really, really quickly. And I thought that was beautiful. And I think, like you said, like marketing mashups is tough. Your art team found a way to sell that really quickly, so that I think you can glance at it and go, okay, I can kind of get where this is going. I mean, I want to know what your reaction was when you got the first look at the cover.
Oh, I couldn't have been happier. And again, one of the great things about working with DAW, you hear all these horror stories from authors who never have any idea what their cover looks like until they see it on a store shelf. And at DAW, they asked me if I had opinions, if I had input. I pitched them on artists and I pitched them on ideas. And we got Chris McGrath to do the art, and they put me in contact with him. And anytime he had a question about the Molenkampi physical makeup or the sizes of the different relative characters or anything, he just reached out to me, and it was a very strong collaboration. So I couldn't have been happier with how all of it came together. I also want to put in a shout out to the team at DAW who did the actual cover design, because once they took Chris's art and they put that kind of ragged, beaten up paperback look to it with the distressed cover and that font for the title, I just think it's perfect. Like you said, you can tell it says 1970s, it says cops, and it says fantasy on it. So I love it.
Yeah, something we've mentioned a couple times here. We've mentioned that the Molenkampi, of which Ajax, who's right there on the cover, you know, is one of, you know, and we've mentioned the squib and stuff. Like for people who are just like first learning about this, could you kind of just walk us through some of the fantasy races of this world and both the physical representation of them and where they sit in sort of like the political climate of things?
Sure. They're described as the 8 families who walk on the path. The path is the central religion of this world. And there's 8 sentient species that live on the planet. In the book, I believe we see 4 of them, hinted and described that to more or lesser degree. The murder victim, who's the central case that is worked on, is a squib. That is a frog-like amphibian who comes from further south and was part of a diplomatic team that the city was hoping to see infuse cash into the city of Titanshade. And the Molenkampi are sort of a hardy stock of people who have big face mandibles to help move food from their primary biting mouth to the secondary eating mouth in their throat. And they speak through both mouths, so they have a tonal voice. And they have head plates. I love describing this stuff because it always sounds so ridiculous to me at the same time.
It was something I thought was really great about them is this description where they have this kind of gruesome, you know, they've got mandibles and it's like you said, they've got 2 mouths. There's one that's for biting and one that they eat and speak that's more in their throat. So they always have like their tie loose so that mouth is available. So right there you have this weird, like, oh, you have 2 mouths and a head and you're odd looking, but at the same time, they've got this harmonic nature to their voices that in my head has to sound kind of beautiful, right? Like it's got this like this really pretty thing because with that setup, they can just sound totally different. And there's a musical quality to it. Their own language is very musical. And Carter, and this is, it's worth noting that this is a first person story, which feels, again, very classic noir. And having a detective narrate it gives you a reason for a person who has so much attention to detail because his job is his nature to do so. But you get that examination of the Molenkampi through him. And, you know, and seeing that they both like watching them eat freaks him out, but at the same time, listening to his partner talk sounds very cool, you know? So I thought that was a really interesting touch on it for sure. You mentioned, you know, that there's the 8, but there's, and 8's a very special number in this world as well. When you talk about the one true path, the religion of it. What are the other 2 that show up in it?
So human, squib, Molenkampi, and Gilman. And the Gilman is another big amphibian, a oversized creature, bipedal with big gills and brachial sacs that kind of flare out and can be used to gauge their temperament. And the other 4 I have planned out, but I haven't dropped those yet in the book. So holding back on those.
Oh yeah, that's the perfect thing to hold on to for sequels and stuff is that ever expanding world. Right at the very beginning, like you mentioned, it is a squib diplomat who dies and it is murdered, and it's the first murder scene of the book and of the main investigation of it. You mentioned a little bit earlier, like the smell of cinnamon, a whiff of cinnamon, and like it's an interesting really note that the squib, basically their internals, if you rip them open, that they affect certain humans on almost like an appetizing level, like to a point where it actually drives them a little crazy in the sense of like the need to feed, and Carter, the POV character, is not immune to that. Right off the bat, you introduce something that's like, it's already gruesome and then take this really different kind of twist on it. How did you come around to that idea, and how do you introduce that right off the bat without like just completely like flooring the reader and making them go, oh my gosh, this is almost too much for me?
The challenge in a scene like that, because we're establishing a fantasy world that nobody knows. So the challenge is establishing it in a way that the reader understands that it's not normal. So it has to be overwhelmingly unusual and disconcerting to Carter. Now, you mentioned it's a first-person POV, and that is a huge asset in that situation because I can show his panic and his internal concern as he starts to understand that something is not right with him while he's standing in this murder scene. And that lets me have all kinds of tools in order to communicate to the reader that this is not normal for this world, even though you don't know what is normal for this world yet. So it was a fantastic shortcut. And it's also a subtle signal to the reader that there's going to be a lot of things that are pivoted and turned throughout the book. You mentioned the Molenkampi, the gruesomeness of the face and the way they scare people, but they have a beautiful voice, and so many of them are gentle, and this and that, so you see that over and over again throughout the course of the book, and I wanted to establish that right from the beginning. So I think it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, very, very well. I started reading the book on a plane. And so I am just getting ready for liftoff, and those are the first sequence I read. And so I was right off, I was like, okay, I'm really in for a ride here. But I knew very clearly a chapter or two into the story that I was like, okay, this is a really well crafted story that I'm going to get into. They always say like your first chapter has to win people over because it's really easy for people to walk away from a book. And yours does that right off the bat, where it establishes an awful lot about that world and the tone and the way it mixes those things. So like you said, fantastic shortcut. It doesn't feel like a shortcut. It just feels like really strong storytelling. So I thought that was excellent. I want to talk about theme and the themes that you found that emerged as you were going through the writing. But as a preface to that, I want to say one thing. When I first saw the book, like I mentioned earlier, that like Alienation had kind of come to mind because, it's the most direct visual I could think of, like going back. If people weren't around in the 80s watching movies, there's a film that has cops, but they're like humans and they're aliens who are on Earth, and has, kind of that similar vibe, but it's sci-fi versus fantasy kind of thing. But there's a distinct difference that I could point out immediately, which is that Alienation uses a lot of metaphor for race relation. And we see that a lot in fantasy and sci-fi too, where a lot of times that tends to be something that becomes allegory rather than just approaching those things head on. That, as much as I can spot it, is not a thing in Titanshade. You are approaching these people as having complicated relations between them as sort of like political states, but not necessarily so much between the races, between humans, between Molenkampi, between squibs and stuff like that. I found that was actually really refreshing that, it didn't need to be an allegory on race. And while I'm sure those touches are there in a subtle way, like sometimes that is really heavy-handed in the story. Correct me if I'm really off base there, but that was my own view of things. So I wanted to see was like what themes you were tackling and what you were finding as the story developed.
First of all, I do think you're right. And I do think there are some elements of racial relations in the book just because I'm a human in the 21st century writing. So it's going to be there.
Yeah.
But there are lots of different sci-fi and fantasy books that use that allegory. And I didn't think that it's my place to use it in that same way. And I don't think that I could have used it as skillfully as it would need to be used. So I had more interest in tackling the individual characters and the individual interactions rather than try to paint on a broader scale. So the themes that I addressed, I think, were a little bit more of the question of working class versus white collar and oil money versus the roughnecks who are actually out there earning it. And how does that impact a town where all that oil money dumps into, and what happens when it dries up? So I have a great deal of interest in how we control the natural resources of a region for the betterment of everybody and how that impacts the people who live in that specific area. Who controls who gives up mineral rights and who controls who gives up energy rights, and what drives us to pursue those concepts. So that was a source of interest for me, and it was something I got to explore a little bit. And I have an ongoing interest in kind of exploring the working class in a fantasy structure, and not the classic Dungeons and Dragons town. There's the innkeeper, there's the blacksmith, the noble, and then the guy with a bag full of gold. There's no distribution of income levels.
Right, yeah.
So you tend to find people who are either it's nobles or it's somebody who's living in complete squalor in an alley. And what you very rarely see in speculative fiction is somebody who's just worried about paying rent that month. Like, they're probably going to make it, but if something happens to their car, they're screwed. And that kind of tension is something that I'd like to bring out and address a little bit more in my fiction. And hopefully I was able to achieve that a little bit without stopping a murder mystery in order to give a lecture on sociology and economics.
I think those elements are all there in a very natural way. I mean, something you hit on there is that Titanshade as a city is built on oil money, is built on the natural resource that is now seems to be running out. Like, they're not finding that there's as much of it available anymore. And the reason why this diplomatic delegation is there from the Squibs in the first place is that they're actually trying to set up wind farms on this land that used to be there for oil, which could potentially economically save the city and the situation it's in. And it's in the best interest of everybody, for the most part, for it to show up. But there are always some kind of, political machination and some people that have money invested somewhere that can make things a tenuous situation. And yeah, I mean, I think this story does a really interesting back and forth between going up to those upper echelons. You're meeting diplomats, you're meeting politicians, but you're also meeting prostitutes, and you're meeting people who are like just struggling to get by. Maybe they have addiction, maybe they have bills to pay, and seeing that is very much classic noir, is exploring all the different levels of a society. But so often, we get into speculative fiction. It's like, it's, princes and princesses and the king and whatnot, and like you said, like we get these two levels, but maybe the people in between are the background characters in the RPG that you walk into their homes and break their barrels and take their gold or something, like in a classic kind of like Nintendo way. So yeah, I like that you approach it that way. You had mentioned something to me when we were emailing about this, that along with that focus on sort of the blue collar level in these stories, that your storytelling process has kind of an assembly line kind of idea. Like you thought about it like from the standpoint of somebody that was like auto assembly, like in the physical world, like how you would do that in writing. Can you like elaborate on that for me a bit?
Sure. When I got the call that my book had gone through, I was working on the Honda assembly line in Marysville, Ohio, and I base a lot of my fiction writing on the structures that I learned on the assembly line. So it's just things like, that line starts and you sit down and you write and you do it. At Honda, if there's danger, if there's a hazard to somebody's health, anybody in that plant can stop the line. There's safety buttons all over the place. You don't do it over something trivial, but in the same way, as a writer, I got to look out for my health. I will stop things if I need to, but then it's back to work. It gets up and rolling again. And it's just understanding that the line doesn't back up. It's not going to wait for you. And you jump on and then you work away at it. And then when you take a break, you come back, and then you go from doing one activity to doing a different activity. On the assembly line, you only do a task for 1 quarter, so for 2 hours. And you're bent over backwards installing airbags on the side frame, for example. And then for another 2 hours, you're bent over forwards installing tail lights. And by changing things up, you don't cramp up. You don't run into problems that way. In the same way, I try to tackle different tasks for different lengths. So it might be additional plotting, it might be editing, it might be working on polishing dialogue. But I don't do the same thing all day long, because otherwise I'll burn out. So changing it up that way keeps me sane, among other things.
Well, I like that idea of like you're using the different muscles and allowing yourself. I mean, I think sometimes you can overtask your brain pushing too hard in one direction. And I think most writers find sooner or later that that if they're asking too much ideation from their brain at any given time, that they'll hit that, writer's block, where if they take a few minutes away and do something else, those background processes can deliver those answers that you need when you weren't actively working on them. So I think that process makes a lot of sense. Do you approach things with any kind of like what I call modular thinking? And what I mean by that is like I think about an assembly line, which I have not worked on, but I come from the background as like a web developer and a coder. And so I always try to think about like, oh, can I break things into pieces where I can move them around? Whereas like, so that if I do encounter an issue, I don't have to redo everything in order to make it work. I can pull one piece out and repair it. Does that make sense? Does that have any kind of application to your writing style?
Yes. What I usually do, for example, when I get critique back from my agent or my editor or one of my critique partners, I'll find out what the major topics are. I work in Scrivener, so I'll drop them into the individual chapters in Scrivener. And even if it means cutting and pasting, because they'll say character A needs to be more sarcastic or whatever the critique is. And then I'll cut it and I'll put it into every place the character A appears. And I don't necessarily need to polish up every bit of that character's dialogue, but by seeing it in every chapter, it's a reminder to kind of bump up that level of sarcasm. And then similarly, I'll take the individual items that they give of something is confusing, something needs to be smoothed out, and drop those all peppered throughout the whole manuscript in the different folders in Scrivener. And then I can go through and I can work on each one of those individually, kind of modularly, polish one up, maybe push another one back so that you don't get too much sarcasm or too much whatever I'm trying to address. Where I don't have that modular sense, though, of being able to pull things out, for me, it's when I get to a certain level of polish, especially with dialogue, that rhythm and that timing of the dialogue, it's like the fine teeth of gears in a pocket watch running together or something. Adding an extra line of dialogue in order to explain a bit of exposition that the reader needs completely throws off the rhythm of that dialogue. And what I often have to do is unpack the entire thing, fix it, put it all together, and then re-polish everything to get it to fit back together. So when you get to a minute enough level, the modularity kind of breaks down, for me anyway. Like other people might be able to get away with it.
Speaking of that kind of thing, are there any like real specific challenges that you ran into that you remember as you were constructing this, like whether it was in the first draft or whether it was, something the editor threw you like later on, like something that you kind of read your head against, had a little trouble with, but then, how did you fix it? What was your solution?
The answer is yes, many. I'm trying to think of one that happens relatively early on in the book. A good example is just the number of characters. For me, I tend to create too many characters because I'm interested in this big city filled with people, and I enjoy picturing people and dropping them in and seeing them interact with each other. That's a big sense of joy for me. But as a result, I will often end up with a cast of characters that's confusingly large and can be distracting for the reader rather than focused. So going back through and finding ways that one character can reappear later on, so that the reader understands like, oh, now we have closure for this person and they can stop thinking about them. That way they each have little arcs. So rather than having 4 people show up over the course of the book, make that one person who shows up 4 times. And that creates a much stronger sense of plot and narrative thrust, I think.
That gives like an approach vector on an idea that I've always wondered about with mystery stories, because it's not something that like, I'm not an enormous mystery reader, but I do like when that's infused into other stories. But it's always that question of, in a novel, especially when you've got something that's 400 or 500 pages, and you do meet a lot of characters, you have a lot of names, you have a lot of details, figuring out how to give the reader enough information so that they remember everybody, so that when somebody shows up again later on, that they know who it is and what their context is, but without at the same time like telegraphing too hard. And like you said, like that's part of that was like, it sounds like you were trimming down characters. Did you have any other times where maybe like the editor was like, okay, we need to remind people of this person or remind them of this bit of context in order for the story to make sense?
I'm actually overall pretty good at that. One of the ways that I go, one of my go-to techniques is to really rely on the relative real estate of the page. So people pay the most attention to the beginning and the end of lists, the beginning and the end of chapters. So if you give the reader a statement at the beginning of a chapter or at the very end of a chapter, it carries more weight and they're more likely to remember it. If you put it in the middle of the chapter, it's a little bit less forgettable. It might still be a really cool image. They might not forget about it completely, but it's not going to carry the same weight. So if you mention something 8 times in a book, but it's always in the middle of a chapter while other stuff is going on, it's not going to be as memorable as if you end a big climactic chapter on that image. You can just mention it once, but it'll stick with everybody for the rest of the book. Another way that you can use that if you want to legitimately drop the clues about the reveal for a mystery, but not draw attention to it, is to put it in the middle of a list of items in a room rather than at the beginning or the end. And the same thing goes for paragraphs, the beginning of the paragraph, the end of the paragraph, the middle of the paragraph.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I was thinking about like, some of my favorite writers, one of the things that I notice about them is that they end chapters really well. That you always get some piece of character interaction or self-realization or a piece of mood that just works. And something that I think of in Titanshade is that there's most of the chapters end on some bit of information that lets you like kind of spin your wheels on things for a minute. Like try and, I think like all mystery readers, like you're trying to whodunit it a little bit and figure your way through. But there's one chapter that just ends on a quiet moment with Carter and his cat. And I really liked that scene because I felt like, we need those moments where we can see people as human as they are when they're by themselves or when with people they love, rather than like in the heat of pressure, because it gives us a broader sense of context and understanding of who they are. And so I like seeing that kind of the change up. And again, a relatively nondescript sequence from the standpoint of it's a guy on a couch with his cat. But it stuck with me because it ended off a chapter and it informed me more about that character. Tell me more about Carter. Because this is a guy, he's our POV character. In a lot of ways, he is an embodiment of the noir downtrodden hero. He is a guy he's got a deep history with a lot of troubling stuff in it. You're revealing it slowly as the story goes along. What more can you tell me about Carter as a character and how you piecemeal out that history a little bit at a time in order to inform the reading audience, but not give them too much to begin with?
The interesting thing about Carter, for me at least, is that he's got a very bitter and dark view about the people around him and the city that he lives in. But that view is driven by the fact that secretly he's an idealist. He's not a cynic. So a cynic or a nihilist would look at everything around them and just think it's awful. He looks at everything and he sees that it's not what it could be. And that's what makes him sad. And that's why he's kind of dark and bitter about things. It sounds like it's not a huge difference, but it actually is a very profoundly different way of looking at the world. He always embraces the light when he sees it. He embraces the people who treat each other well. So it lets me have that classic hard-boiled kind of bitter noir narrator who also has a great deal of compassion for other people. And that makes him a much more interesting character to write and hopefully to read about. And as for kind of parceling out the background, that just takes a lot of trial and error on my part, is breaking it out and putting it out too much and realizing that I'm wrong, reeling it back in and trying it again. So that's definitely one of the harder bits of writing for me, especially novel length work.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned Carter's sort of innate optimism or hope for optimism, because there's a moment where Ajax is a partner he gets saddled with, and it's not a comfortable position for them right at the beginning of the story, but they very quickly kind of learn to embrace each other's strengths and quirks. But there's a moment where Ajax evaluates something about Carter, and he sees that Ajax is leans towards seeing the good in people rather than the darkness. That's a fascinating idea that Carter sees that in him, and he has that might be a problem, but I'm not sure. But he himself is also kind of in that same vein. So I think that's a neat note on there. In constructing that buddy cop dynamic and figuring out how to balance, you mentioned balancing sarcasm and antagonism versus slowly forming friendship. What beats are you looking for to accomplish that so that it, over the course of a story, that it makes sense? I feel like in movies, a lot of times you have characters get thrown together and you have to really really figure out how to make that story work so people don't feel like it's just plot that like, okay, now we're friends now. That moment they're like, did we just become best friends? Yeah. That kind of thing. Like where, how is it organic? When does it make sense? Knowing that in real life, we don't always trust people or don't always become friends easily. And then sometimes it only takes a random one joke or one particular moment or one shared thing and we can bond. So figuring that out, how did you handle that?
I always use the braided rose imagery when I'm working on characters that way, which is like you have these two characters and they're amazing on their own. They're beautiful like a rose, but they also have the thorns and the prickers. So you acknowledge the fact that there's something wrong with them, that they have their vulnerabilities or their quirks that make them difficult to approach. But if you take those two roses and you align them just right, the prickers overlap and don't puncture each other. And you can braid the roses together, and together it's even more beautiful. It's completely stolen from somebody else, and I wish I could remember.
I've never heard that before. That's amazing. Oh, that's a great visual.
I wish I could remember who so that I could give them credit. But it's not from me. But it's that moment of sliding those two parallel roses together, and they're pricking each other, and they're not working, and then all of a sudden they snap together and they fit. And when they fit, it's that moment that you're like, oh man, it's worked. It's come together, and they still got the prickers. They're still not perfect. They'll still cut you, but they fit together. And then that works for romantic relationships, and it works for buddy cops, and it works for any kind of characters who are thrown together that way.
And I think it's one of the most fulfilling aspects of a story. I think something that people they always want. They want that moment of connection and the point where friction smooths out and zippers up together. Like you said, the thorns, kind of connecting. So that's a really good visual. I like that. And I think that's knowing that it's writers that listen to this show, that's one of those like nice takeaways to think about, like how you put people together and characters together. So I think that is awesome. So, something you mentioned earlier, you use Scrivener, so that is part of your tool set. Are you primarily an outliner? What's your methodology for constructing story and then fleshing it out?
For me, it depends on the length of the piece that I'm working on. Short stories, I usually just sit down and go, especially like a flash story or something like that. For something longer, a lot of times I'll plot it out and I'll do story beats and then develop it from there. I'm a really big fan of story structure, and I'm a huge nerd for that kind of stuff. For a novel, for me, it's so far at the edge of my craft to keep a story with that many spinning plates going. I have to have an outline, and I have to have everything written out and planned out in front of me. I don't always stick to it, but I need to have it there, or else I would just panic and hide my head under the pillows and never do anything. And for me, outlining and structure are very much diagnostic tools rather than planning tools. So I kind of have a loose outline. I go ahead and I write the book, and then I go back in and I make sure that I'm hitting those beats that I need to. For example, we're talking about hitting the noir and the fantasy beats, and that's true whether you wanted to write a romantic thriller or whatever. You got to hit all that stuff, and making sure that you're hitting them in about the time frame that people are expecting is really important.
You mentioned, the fantasy versus modern day realism kind of things. Did you have any point in the story where you introduced a fantasy element that you realized was either story breaking or plot complicating or something that you needed to like pull out? Is there any point where you were like, oh, okay, maybe I'm letting the world building stretch too far and I need to pull it back?
I don't think so. I know that there were things that I started to write in, and then what I would do is I would back off on the details. Because if I let the reader fill in some of the details, I don't have to get too specific and I don't get too tied down. If it's something that I know is going to be important later on, I'll stick to those details. I'll find a way to make it honest so that it doesn't feel like I'm changing up the rules later on. But no, generally speaking, I write fairly light early drafts. So I'm adding material rather than taking away. So I tend to go fairly skeletal in my first draft and then build things from there.
I like the way you put that, like the skeletal and then fleshing it out essentially versus like, the opposite direction is sort of like taking like the block of marble and sculpting it down into something, like two very different approaches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Outside of Scrivener, is there any other tools of the trade that you lean into? Like, do you ever work on paper or have any other things that are valuable to your process?
Yeah, I keep one notebook at a time. Just these, I get them at Michael's Hobbies. They're $5. These big, thick notebooks, it's drawing pads. And everything that I think of and everything that I see gets written down in there. Anything I see in a magazine that's interesting to me, it might be inspirational, I cut it out and I paste it in there. And it's my brain book for about 6 months. And I decorate it and I make it fun and I take it everywhere with me. And I sketch in it, I lay things out, and it really is like my living brain for me for that period of time.
I love that because in the digital age, sometimes I think we don't have enough physical artifacts of the creative process. Artists do tend to, but a lot of them have moved into digital format. But I think about like writers of the past, and like we have their notebooks and, you know, these preserved things in collections and in museums and stuff. But in the modern age, like, oh, how do I take my Evernote and, you know, and, and make that as an artifact? So I love it when people do have that physical brain dump somewhere. If nothing else, I always think that'll make a great family heirloom, part of the personal legacy, like well down the way. You're like, you hope that, you know, the heirs to the family somewhere along the ways will be like, oh, well, that's the seeds of this novel, stuff like that.
Also, when I do my first drafts, I print them all out and I 3-hole punch them, and I put them into a 3-ring binder that I've custom airbrushed, like some kind of imagery on the cover of it. And then I've shellacked it with polyurethane with so many coats that it feels like a trapper keeper. So I can walk around and pretend like I've got my 8th grade trapper keeper with me, and I've got all my ideas in it.
I always love seeing like what writers do to create a physical presence for their stories, whether it's like posting up cutouts or something of like faces or people that you're like, oh, that's kind of this character, or this is my inspiration for this thing, or like it's that combination from, like you said, like almost the childish, joyful representation all the way down to the madman's serial killer wall with the with the lines all over the place. So I always figure that like there's a certain madness involved in writing, and and finding a way to make that into joy is a part of the self-care process in there too. So I love hearing about that. I hope that you post photos of those at some point because I want to see your version of a trapper keeper. As we wrap this thing up, I want to know what other media stories creators are filling your mind right now. What are influencing your own thinking about story, or what's just the stuff you're enjoying?
I'm reading so many other debut novels right now. I just read The Bobcat by Catherine Forbes Riley, which is this really beautiful rumination on trauma. And she just avoids all the stereotypical tropes that you usually run into with stories like that. And it's just so sparse and skillfully written. And it's just really fantastic. And also, what else did I read recently? Famous Men Who Never Lived by Kate Chess.
Oh, I've heard about that one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's a kind of a literary speculative mashup about a wave of immigrants from an alternate dimension who come to New York after a natural disaster, and how they cope with a world that diverged about 70 years ago. So everything is pretty similar, but just different enough to make everybody uncomfortable and make the skills not translate. So it's a really fantastic book as well.
What about TV and film? Is there anything like holding your attention right now?
I have not watched a lot of TV. We just finished watching The Americans, finally caught up on that. That's a brilliant show and a phenomenal ending to it. Versailles is really fantastic. Haven't watched the final season yet, but I'm looking forward to that. And films, what have I watched lately? I don't know. I'm blanking on films right now, but I watch movies all the time.
Sometimes the trouble, I think, asking people those questions is that there's such a proliferation of entertainment now. And there are so many times where like I absorb something that has the paradigm shift and it's all I can talk about for a while. And then there's 100 other things that I will consume and will enjoy, but don't leave that same kind of mark. And it's funny, like I feel like I get, generally speaking, more out of serial TV these days than I do out of film. Occasionally there's something will come along that will really shake my tree. But in general, there are things that like, oh, I really enjoyed that, but maybe don't leave the lasting mark that long-term storytelling and something that I can really chew on over a long stretch, has for me.
Yeah, exactly. And there's something about the bite-sized nature of an hour-long episode. It's just like eating a bag of chips. They're so satisfying, and they're short and they're condensed. And you can watch one and you can stop, or you can just binge and just chow down the whole bag. It's really amazing.
Much like you were talking about earlier, as far as like how, ending your chapters, beginning your chapters with something strong. TV is kind of that same way, the beginning and ending, and then if it's on, traditional broadcast, like how they act break into commercials and stuff can have such a big impact. And when you have a really strong hour-long episode of something, I feel like the X-Files back in the day was so good at giving you like a last scene that would stick with you afterwards. And if you were watching it in broadcast, you had a week of just like mulling over that, like, oh geez, that like paranoid like injection into your brain that you couldn't shake and then you get into the next episode, they wouldn't even answer that, or whatever. They just go on to the next thing to make your brain break. So long-term serial TV kind of stuff has a little bit more of a connection to the way like books work sometimes.
Absolutely.
Dan, as we wrap up, like I said earlier, Titanshade is available now in stores. Where should people be following you and finding out about the stuff you do next?
I'm on all the usual suspects as far as social media, and you can find links to all that stuff at my website, which is danstout.com. And it's got a full list of my short stories that are available and my mailing list and all my social media stuff.
I want to make a point of saying, as for people who are listening to this and are trying to figure out like how they want to do their websites and their presence as writers and creators, what you have on your site, in particularly like your bio page, your press page, the information you have there is so well put together from the standpoint of a person doing, content creation and putting these things out. Part of my job, and doing a podcast like this is promoting the work of the person who's on the show. And sometimes it can be really difficult to just find the right stuff from somebody. I mean, occasionally even finding like a notable writer who just has a BS bio that I can't use because it's, a bunch of like fluffy goofiness that works on their site, but doesn't work from a press capacity, So I was really, really happy to find that like the stuff that you had on your site, I thought was really effective. It was the perfect kind of thing that helps me help you. And I encourage our listeners to go take a look at that stuff because I think you've got a really good template for the right way to do it.
Oh, and everyone should feel totally free to steal that template and use it for themselves, because the only reason those pages exist are to make life easier for people like you so that you can help promote the book and help spread the word. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's very, very appreciated. So that is awesome. Like I said before, Titanshade is now available from DAW Books out in the stores. Are you on the tweets and stuff? Where should people follow you? What's your name on the socials?
On Twitter, I'm at Dan Stout. And on Facebook, I am Dan Stout Writer.
Awesome. Well, Dan, thank you so much. I think Titanshade is some awesome stuff, and I look forward to see where your writing goes after this.
Oh, thanks so much again for having me. This was so much fun.
The home for all things fictitious, including every episode and review, is fictitiouspodcast.com. You can find the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Fictitious Pod, and you can chat with me directly on Twitter, where I'm at Adrian Buskey. Subscribe to Fictitious on iTunes, Google Play, or Spotify so you don't miss all of my upcoming interviews and reviews, and be sure to check out the previous author interviews exploring the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.